evening. It's good to be with you. Motzi Shabbos, a good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Thank God we're starting it by learning together. I'm a little bit shaken. We all are in our community. I want to dedicate our learning tonight to Yossi Hershkovitz. We heard about him tonight by the third meal, or this, late today, late Shabbos, by the third meal, Shalosh Sudos, a member of our minyan, because his daughter and his grandchildren live here in our neighborhood, and our good friend Morris, who normally lives in Israel, spends many weeks of the year with us, and he got up by the third meal to tell us that actually a friend of his from the Israeli consulate had come to his place where he's staying, to his daughter's house, I guess, on Shabbos, to let him know that his sister's son, so his nephew, is this gentleman, Yossi Hershkovitz, this hero, and he was killed. You can read about it. I guess we'll post the article. There's one on Aretz Sheva, Israel National News. And he was a reservist, 44 years old, 5 children, leading a unit that actually, got intel about some of the attackers on October 7th who had taken hostages. They were hiding in a building. The unit surrounded it, and their leader, Yossi, and his Hebrew name with his mother's name is Yossi ben Rechama, Rechuma, I think Rechuma. But at any rate, his full secular name is Yossi Hershkovitz, and is the way of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces, the leader goes first. So he went in the door. There was an explosion. The rest of the unit completed the mission, thank God. And Yossi leaves 5 kids. I think the youngest is a baby, I don't know, 3 months or 3 years old. I'm sorry, I don't quite remember which it was, but it was one or the other. The baby's either 3 years or 3 months old. And the family is just brokenhearted. Our friend Morris is getting on a plane tonight to go for the funeral. So we dedicate our learning today to the memory and for an elevation in the world of souls of this hero, Yossi Hershkovitz, who fell Kiddush Hashem, defending the Holy Land of Israel from these savages who carried out the October 7th attacks. Okay. Who's in there? Let me light it up. Let's light up the darkness. That's our job. That's how we stand our post, learning in his memory and for the sake of peace in the Holy Land. Welcoming Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Elvis in New York, Bill in mid-Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, Elvis and Mickey, and Debbie. Welcome everybody. It's funny, Elvis. I appreciate what you're saying. That I lead in Kaddish. I know that in some parts of the Jewish world, they say Kaddish, with an online group. But in our community, we only say it with a minyan, of 10 guys in the room. But I really appreciate the sentiment. And so, I'm not saying Kaddish, because I'm not saying it in Aramaic. But why not just say it in English? As a learning exercise, shall we say, right? So we're learning Kaddish. What is that? And it's actually great to read it in English from time to time because we say it so often that we don't really think about necessarily about what it is that we're saying when we're saying it in English. I mean, when we're saying it in Aramaic. It's funny, in this siddur, is it not translated? And this siddur puts it in transliteration alongside. Not all my siddurim are. Nina, could you just bring me the art scroll? Side by side translation. Regular siddur, full siddur. It's interesting. Actually, very interesting. It's funny. This is the Chabad siddur, and they want to just make sure that everyone's included. So rather than translate the Kaddish, they just put it, in what do you call it? It's transliteration, right? Where you can sound it out, in English letters, but not the actual translation. All right, so when Nina gets me that, we'll just pause and do it. And we'll start with magnified and sanctified is God's name. All right, but let's start learning our daf, and then we'll interrupt for that momentarily. Okay, so our daf is page Daled, page 4, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 1. And, unlike some of the other tractates where the sages like to jump to the most, nuanced and challenging question within their world, right? Rather than just sort of lay out the basics of the law, right? So we saw that in Tractate Yevamos, where we have the situation of a man who dies childless and he leaves a widow and a brother. And so then they have a yibum obligation to each other. So rather than just lay out the basic law, it starts with this very complicated case of when the man had 2 wives and one wife exempts the other wife from having a yibum obligation because she has some kind of familial relationship with the brother, even though the other wife doesn't, etc. Very complicated. So here that we're talking about damages, and we're introducing the whole order, the whole seder of this whole section of the Talmud, 3 tractates talking about damages. It's very nice, actually, to sort of get the basics in place, right? So what the Mishna is doing and what the Gemara is exploring is exactly, okay, so we're talking about damages. So when does a person become liable to pay damages? Because he, inflicted some kind of a damage, some kind of an injury on another party, whether it was the person's body or his property or, his relative or his slave. This was the ancient world. And we've been talking about categories, not to be, technical legalese, but really to make sure that we understand that since the Torah distinguishes between these primary categories of damage, right, that an ox can do, and then we talked about, well, an ox there are primary categories involving an ox, whether he is hurting someone with its horns by goring, or just, by eating the produce because it was hungry, or by trampling over, and that these become models for the types of damage that your animal or, other agents of your property that could be hurting other people, whether, it's an animal acting with a will to create damage, or it's an animal just doing what it does, pursuing pleasure, or it's an animal who's allowed to walk or even is being led, and in its walking tramples over something. And these are sort of, you'll see that we can extend these ideas to all kinds of things. I remember that I was once acting as a judge in a Jewish moot court competition, and what they were talking about is a lawsuit that would involve programming self-driving cars with AI, and and this is a problem that is certainly coming. And then how do you program a car if it's a situation where, there's a pedestrian, but to swerve to avoid the pedestrian, you're going to hit, 2 pedestrians, or you're going to crash into a store, you're going to crash into another car, or the driver is going to be killed. Right? Either kill the pedestrian or the driver is killed by, swerving into a telephone pole. And these kinds of questions are very much related to this sort of groundwork we're establishing here. Right, so those are the 3 kinds of damage that an ox could do. And then we talked about a pit, right, where somebody digs a pit in the public domain and leaves it there. He's created a hazard. It's not moving, but people can be damaged by it. Or somebody who starts a fire and allows it to get out of control, and then it can do enormous damage. And then we have this fourth category called maveh, and we're exploring this debate, as it were, between Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel says that maveh refers to one of the types of damage that an ox can do, namely eating. And Rav says, no, maveh doesn't refer to the ox at all. It refers to the damage that humans do. If they punch each other or strike each other, spit on each other, throw something that then hurts a person, that maveh must refer to humans, right? So there's where we are. Now, the Gemara asks, but isn't it possible to derive goring from eating? Right, now that we're talking about, they're still having this argument, where does maveh fit in? And so they're exploring, okay, well, which are actually primary categories and which are not? Now, the reason why these primary categories matter is because they're going to be treated differently. How much compensation is owed by the owner of the ox, or the one who dug the pit, or the one who created the fire? When does he become liable? When is he not liable? That's why these categories matter. So we continue that discussion at the top of 4a. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it possible to derive goring, right, with the horns, from eating by means of a kal v'chomer inference? So if in a case of eating where it is not the objective of the animal to cause damage, its owner is liable. So with regard to goring, where the objective of the animal is to cause damage, right? When an ox gores someone, it's trying to hurt the thing that it's goring. Whereas when it's eating and it causes damage to your neighbor because your ox eats his produce, okay, but the ox was only trying to just, get its belly full. When the ox is goring, so if I'm going to be liable for my ox eating my neighbor's produce, all the more so I should be liable when my ox gores my neighbor's ox or my neighbor himself. Right? So if in the case of eating, where it is not the objective of the animal to cause damage and nevertheless the owner is liable, then with regard to goring, where the objective of the animal is to cause damage, should the owner not all the more so be liable? Right? And the reason we're saying this is, well, since it can be derived that the owner is liable, obviously in the case of goring, since it's so much worse than a case of eating, why do we need these to be separate categories? Right? And the Gemara answers, well, nevertheless, it was necessary for the Torah to state the case of goring, as it might enter your mind to say that the owner is exempt, just as he is exempt in the case where his slave or maidservant causes damage. When a slave or maidservant causes damage, is it not so that although their objective is to cause damage, even so their owners are exempt from liability? And so too, when one's animal causes damage, it is no different. So to dispel this notion, the Torah explicitly states that one is liable for damage caused by the primary category of goring. And you understand what the argument was. Well, wait a minute. If back when slavery existed in the ancient world, if your slave, got angry at someone in the marketplace and attacked him and killed him, are you liable? Would you be liable? And you could say in kind of modern parlance, what if your employee, goes crazy and attacks, some customer? I mean, there's definitely going to be a lawsuit, right? You can imagine that. What is your standard of care that you owe, when you hire that person or when you allow, in the ancient world, your slave to go out into the marketplace? Now, obvious, and the Torah says you're not liable when your slave goes and attacks someone. I suppose it might be different if your slave is a known murderer and you sent him into the marketplace. That's probably different. But if you have no reason to know that, you're not going to be liable. Why? Because the slave is still a human being who is going to be liable and, for his own. He's going to be accountable for his own crimes. And that's not pinned on the owner. But an ox, that's different, right? You're responsible for your livestock. You feed it, you tend it, you allowed it to go loose, right? And it's going to be a different outcome if the ox was a habitual gorer, known to be dangerous, or an innocuous ox, as it's being called in English, the one that is not known to have done such a thing in the past. Now, Rav Ashi said, Is that to say that in a case where one slave or maidservant causes damage, there is not a substantial reason to exempt the master? In that case, there is concern that perhaps his master will provoke him, and in retribution, he will go and set fire to another person's stack of grain. And it is found that this slave renders his master liable to pay 100 maveh, which is 10,000 dinars each day. Therefore, there is no basis for the notion that an ox that gores would be exempt just as the slave is exempt, as perhaps fundamentally one is liable to pay for damage caused by his slave. Right? So they're arguing now, okay, the Torah exempts a master from paying for, like a crime or let's say damage that his slave does to another because he's an independent person. But it's not that the master wouldn't bear responsibility, since he should be responsible, but perhaps the reason that the Torah exempts the master is because the slave is not only an independent thinker who's liable for his own crimes, but also if we made the master liable for the slave's harm that he causes another, the slave might do it on purpose in order to hurt the master. When he's mad at his master, if his master were to be liable for his actions, the slave might go and damage someone just to make the master liable. And perhaps that's why, anticipating that situation, the Torah exempted the master, but fundamentally the master would be liable. Since that's possible, maybe we can't compare a slave doing damage and being exempt to an ox doing damage and the master being held liable, since there's so many differences between those two cases. So rather, the Mishnah refutes any possibility to derive the laws of ox from maveh or maveh from ox. That's how we got to this. Right? We're still trying to, Rav and Shmuel debate, what does maveh mean, right? Of the four principal kinds of damage, ox, pit, fire, and maveh. Does maveh actually mean one of the categories of the ox, eating, or does it mean the damage that humans do? They're still arguing that. So the Mishnah is now refuting that, no way, the maveh can't be related to ox, right? It's proving Rav's point as opposed to Shmuel. And how does it do that? So the characteristic of the category of goring, where the objective of the animal is to cause damage, is not similar to the characteristic of the category of eating, where it is not the objective of the animal to cause damage. And the characteristic of the category of eating, where there is pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage, is not similar to the characteristic of the category of goring, where there is no pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage, right? It's not getting pleasure out of goring, right? It's not a homicidal ox. Now, according, or rather a psychotic ox, right? Or psychopathic ox, right? According to Rav Yehuda's explanation of Shmuel's opinion, among the primary categories of damage caused by an ox, the Mishnah mentions only goring and eating. And the Gemara asks, but what of the category of trampling? Did the tanna of the Mishnah omit it from the Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, the principle stated in general terms at the end of the Mishnah. And when a component of any of these categories causes damage, the owner the owner or the generator of the component that caused the damage is obligated to pay restitution from his best quality land. This serves to include the primary category of trampling. So the Gemara asks, but if the intent of the Tanna, the rabbi of the Mishnah, is to teach the primary category of trampling as well among the primary categories of goring and eating, then let him teach it explicitly. Accordingly, Rav Yehuda's explanation of how Shmuel interprets the Mishnah is rejected, right? And what's so interesting here is that, so remember, our Mishnah here, there's a couple of Mishnahs being discussed, but our Mishnah here in chapter 1 says that the four primary categories are ox, pit, fire, and maveh, right? But then as we got into the Gemara, it said, okay, well, you would think that eating, trampling, and goring would be considered subcategories of ox, right? That would be the simple way to organize this. But that's not what they're saying, right? They're saying actually that there are four primary categories, right, that we already said in the Mishnah. And these three ways in which an ox gores, these are also primary categories. So it's not that there's four, it's actually that there's six. And as we'll see, this number is going to go up. Now, rather, Rava said, according to Shmuel, the Tanna teaches ox specifically with regard to actions that cause damage with its foot. And it teaches maveh with regard to actions that cause damage with its tooth, right? So Rav is saying, well, perhaps Shmuel is saying, he wouldn't say that when our Mishnah says ox, that includes all three just need to be spelled out as primary categories. Shmuel might say, no, ox just means foot, and maveh means tooth. Where does goring fit in? We don't know yet. Let's see, according to this understanding of our Mishnah. Right, so Rava said that according to Shmuel, the Tanna of our Mishnah teaches ox specifically with actions with regard to the foot, and maveh teaches with regard to the tooth, meaning eating. And when the Mishnah contrasts ox with maveh, this is what our Mishnah is saying. The defining characteristic of the primary category of trampling, right, with its foot, where its damage is commonplace, is not similar to the defining characteristic of the primary category of eating, where its damage is not commonplace. And the defining characteristic of the primary category of eating, where there is pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage, is not similar to the characteristic of the primary category of trampling, where there is no pleasure for the animal in the course of its causing damage, right? So it's different ways to say, well, the Tanna who formulated our Mishnah, what was he thinking? Exactly how was he formulating these categories? According to Rav Yehuda's explanation of Shmuel's opinion, among the primary categories of damage with regard to an ox, the Mishnah mentions only goring and trampling. So the Gemara asks, but what of the primary category of goring? Did the Tanna omit it from the Mishnah? Right? It just says ox. And the Gemara answers the principle stated in general terms at the end of the Mishnah. And when a component of any of these causes damage, the one who caused the damage is obligated to pay. And that final catch-all includes goring. So the Gemara asks, but if the intent of the Tanna who formulated our Mishnah was to teach or was to include the primary category of goring, why didn't he say so explicitly? Right? It was in the Gemara that it said, okay, ox includes eating, trampling, and goring. Why didn't the Mishnah say that in the first place when it just said ox? That's what we keep asking. And the Gemara explains, it is with regard to those categories of damage where the animal is forewarned from the outset and the owner is liable to pay for the entire damage the first time his animal causes damage that the Tanna of the Mishnah speaks. That would be as opposed to goring, right? Goring, you only have to pay the full damages when you know that the ox is a gorer, right? Because it has done so in the past. Whereas there's other categories where you have to pay the full damages because you should always realize that your animal will do that if it's allowed, to get out and eat your neighbor's produce or to trample over someone's produce. Is warned from the outset that our Mishnah is speaking. But with regard to those categories of damage where the animal is initially innocuous and the owner is liable to pay only half the cost of the damage caused by the animal, and the animal is ultimately forewarned, and then the owner would have to pay the full damages, the Tanna of our Mishnah is not speaking about them, right? So that's why goring is left out. After addressing the reason that Rav did not say that maveh refers to eating in accordance with the explanation of Shmuel, so the Gemara asks, okay, so Rav doesn't hold like Shmuel. Shmuel says that maveh is referring to eating as one of the categories of how an ox does damage. Rav says no, maveh means human, when humans directly cause damage. So now the Gemara asks, okay, as for Shmuel, what is the reason that he did not say that maveh refers to man as does Rav? Why does Shmuel come up with this other idea that complicates everything? Rav's explanation is much more straightforward. We get it, okay? There's ox, there's fire, there's pit, and there's human damage. Why would we say that maveh actually refers to one of the, not subcategory, but one of the primary categories included in ox? Why would Shmuel make it so complicated? So Shmuel could answer, if it enters your mind to say that maveh means human damage when humans damage each other, directly. Well, isn't it taught in the latter clause of the Mishnah that we will encounter on page 15b that both a forewarned ox, right, one who was damaged before, and an ox that causes damage in the domain of the injured party, that entered the domain of the injured party and did the damage there, and any damage caused by man, right? So when we get to that Mishnah, it's going to group these three kinds of damagers: the ox, the habitual gorer, an ox that did the goring in the domain of not a gorer, but an ox that just causes damage within the domain of the injured party, and damage is caused by humans. So apparently, human, right, here it's just translated as man, right, so man was mentioned in the latter clause of the Mishnah because it was not mentioned in the first clause. And the Gemara asks, but let the Tanna teach man among the primary categories of damage in the first clause. And the Gemara explains, it is with regard to those categories of damage caused by one's property that the Tanna of our Mishnah speaks. But with regard to the category of damage caused by one's body, meaning the category of man, the Tanna of our Mishnah does not speak. So that would be an argument for Shmuel, that maveh must mean something that is property of people, like its animal eating and causing damage, rather than a person himself. So the Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. According to Rav, the same difficulty arises. Isn't damage caused by man taught in the latter clause of the Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, Rav could have said to you, the mention of damage caused by a man in the latter part of our Mishnah comes to enumerate the damage together with other forms of damage in a case where the owner of the cause of the damage or the generator of that damage is forewarned. In other words, you had reason to know that this damage could happen. You're considered like you were on notice, like an ox that's a habitual gorer, or like in terms of you damaging another, you don't have to say, gee, I never did that before. I can't believe I did that, so I shouldn't be held liable because of it. No, if you caused damage, you knew perfectly well that you could cause damage, and so you're going to be held liable. Now the Gemara asks, and according to Rav, what is the meaning of the statement in the Mishnah? The defining characteristic of the primary category of ox is not similar to the defining characteristic of the primary category of maveh. Well, that would certainly make sense if we're saying that maveh means man. And the Gemara explains, this is what the Mishnah is saying, the defining characteristic of the primary category of ox, where if the ox kills a person, the owner pays the ransom to the heirs of the injured party, is not similar to the defining characteristic of the primary category of man, where one who kills another does not pay the ransom for killing him. Rather, if he killed him unwittingly, he is exiled to a city of refuge. And if a human kills another human intentionally, well, that's murder, and the death penalty applies, right? So this ransom, the kofer, which is a specific legal term in this context, only applies when your animal kills another person, not when you kill another person, right? It's not that we're saying that you have less guilt if you kill, you have more guilt. But in terms of paying this ransom, here's the note. If I don't like this term forewarned ox that the Koran is using, but we're talking about, the habitual gorer, right? The ox that has gored in the past on numerous occasions. So if the habitual gorer goes and gores a human being and kills him, the ox is stoned, and the owner must pay a ransom. Ransom is not paid for a murder, as a murderer is liable to receive court-imposed capital punishment. By contrast, one whose ox kills another is liable to receive death at the hand of heaven. He therefore pays a ransom through which he is released from that punishment. What is the amount of the ransom? Beyond the scope of tonight's discussion, but we will get to it. Okay, so the Gemara questions Rav's understanding. Wait a minute, where was I? And the defining characteristic of the primary category of man, right, when a human does damage to another person directly, where if one injures another, he is liable to pay 4 types of damages, i.e. pain, humiliation, medical costs, and the loss of livelihood, in addition to payment for the actual damage, right? So there's 4 additional damages in addition to the actual physical damage. And this is not similar to the defining characteristic of the primary category of ox, where the owner of the ox is not liable to pay 4 types of indemnity and is liable to pay only the actual cost of the damage. Now, the Gemara questions Rav's understanding that ox, as mentioned in the Mishna, includes all actions an ox performs that cause damage, including goring. Where am I? Including. What happened here? Sorry. Including goring, based on the continuation of the Mishnah. The common denominator of the components in all these primary categories of damage is that it is their typical manner to cause damage. So the Gemara asks, but is it the typical manner of an ox to cause damage by goring? And the Gemara answers, the statement in the Mishnah is with regard to a forewarned ox, right? The habitual gorer. So yes, that's its nature. So the Gemara asks, but is it the typical manner of the habitual gorer to cause damage by goring? Yes. Once it was forewarned after goring repeatedly, we now say its typical manner is to cause damage by goring. So the Gemara questions Rav's understanding that maveh is the primary category of man, right? So is that for sure what Rav says, and why does he say it? Now, is it man's typical manner to cause damage? And the Gemara answers, right, do people go around damaging each other? Is that typical? It seems atypical. But here's a very interesting answer. The Gemara answers that the statement in the Mishnah about a human being, that it's typical manner of a human's to cause damage, it's referring to the kind of damage that one causes while sleeping. And the Gemara asks, is it typical? Is it the typical manner of a person to cause damage while sleeping? And the Gemara answers, yes. Since one contracts and extends his limbs while sleeping, it is his typical manner to damage objects which are placed right next to him while he's asleep. Now, if maveh is referring to man, is it correct to state, as the Mishnah does in its enumeration of common denominators of the primary categories, and responsibility for their safeguarding is incumbent upon you, meaning the owner, right? Our Mishnah said that where your ox causes damage, or your pit causes damage, or a fire that you started causes damage, well, one of the common denominators of those 3 kinds of dangers that you create and that end up damaging other people is that they're in your control, right? It's the safeguarding to make sure that your ox, your fire, and your pit don't hurt other people. The responsibility for safeguarding them from causing that damage to others is incumbent on you, the owner. Now, what about man? If we worded it like that the safeguarding is incumbent on you, but now we say that maveh means man, well, who is it incumbent on? Like, you'd obviously say that, a person doing damage, it's on him not to damage others. But the Mishnah is formulated in the second person, you, and that syntax doesn't quite fit this. That's what the challenge is now. Right? The Mishnah is formulated as the responsibility for their safeguarding is incumbent on you, meaning the owner, the ox, the fire, the pit. How is this going to apply to maveh? That formulation is appropriate in cases where one is safeguarding another person, animal, or item. When applied to the primary category of man, capital M, it would indicate that responsibility to safeguard one person is incumbent upon another person. Now, with regard to man, responsibility for safeguarding his body is incumbent upon him alone, not on anyone else. So why would you say on you when you're talking about him? So the Gemara responds, and according to your reasoning that the formulation and their safeguarding is incumbent upon you, would indicate that maveh is not man, that because of this formulation, we're going to say that, Shmuel must have been right, and maveh refers to, an ox eating somebody else's produce. But there is a difficulty with that, which the sage Karna taught in a Baraisa. There are 4 primary categories of damage, and man is one of them. So Karn is telling us, okay, sounds like ox, fire, pit, and man, right? Now that Baraisa continues and states that one common denominator is their safeguarding is incumbent upon you. So with regard to that Baraisa, the same question arises with regard to man. Responsibility for safeguarding his body is incumbent upon him, not anyone else. And the wording of Karna sounds imprecise. So rather, just as Rabbi Abahu said to the Tanna who was reciting the Baraisa in the study hall, teach the Baraisa, and with regard to man, responsibility for safeguarding his body is incumbent upon him. Right? They say reword the Baraisa that when it comes to man, that his responsibility for safeguarding himself from damaging others is incumbent upon him, not you, the guy listening to this. So here too, teach this Mishnah, and with regard to man, responsibility for safeguarding his body is incumbent upon him. Now we're on page 4b. Rav Mari objects to the Gemara's initial suggestion that the dispute between Rav and Shmuel with regard to the meaning of maveh is based on biblical terms with similar etymology. He suggests, but why not say that maveh, this is the primary category of damage caused by water? Why does maveh have to be either tooth, meaning that an ox is eating, or man and all the direct damage that he causes? Why not say something that's more similar to the other items in the list and say that maveh refers to water? That would actually make the whole thing a little bit easier. And why would you say that this is water? As it is written, Isaiah 64:1, as when fire ignites brushwood, fire boils water. And the word for boils here is tiveh. So tiveh is similar to maveh. It shares the same root. So that would be a reason to say that maveh means water, when water does damage. And the Gemara rejects this. Is it written in the verse, water boils from fire, which would be nivu, with water, a plural noun in Hebrew, the subject of the intransitive plural verb nivu? No, it's written, fire boils water, tiveh. And since tiveh is a transitive singular verb, the subject is fire, which is a singular noun. Therefore, no proof can be adduced from this verse that maveh would refer to an action caused by water. Now, Rav Zevid objects to the Gemara's initial suggestion that the dispute between Rav and Shmuel with regard to the meaning of maveh is based on biblical terms with similar etymology. Why are you saying that? He suggests, why not say that maveh, this is the primary category of fire? Now, fire is already on the list. So if we say that maveh refers to fire, that's going to create the same difficulty as if maveh refers to, one of the categories involving an ox. But, says Rav Zevid, why not say that maveh refers to fire? As when the term tiveh is written in this verse from Isaiah, it is written with regard to fire. If so, what is the meaning when the Mishnah enumerates the primary categories of damage, that the category of maveh and the category of fire are both included in this short list, indicating that they are different? And if you would say that there are not two distinct categories, but rather the Mishnah is explaining the meaning of maveh, if so, why does the Mishnah say there are 4 primary categories of damage? There would only be 3 if maveh referred to fire. And if you would say, anyway, that maveh is fire, and there are 4 categories in the Mishnah, as the Mishnah teaches the primary category of ox, in which there are 2 primary categories of damage, namely eating and trampling, then the Mishnah would remain difficult. If it is so that maveh in the Mishnah is referring to fire, what is the meaning of that which the Mishnah states with regard to the common denominator of maveh and ox? And the defining characteristic of this category of ox and the category of maveh, in which there is a living spirit, are not similar to the defining characteristic of the next category in the Mishnah, which would be pit and fire, in which there is no living spirit. So accordingly, how can maveh mean fire? What living spirit is there in fire? Fire is beautiful to watch, like around the campfire, and it's ever random, and you could say there's kind of a life, it's lively, but you can't say there's a living spirit like there is in an ox or a human. And furthermore, if maveh is fire, what is the meaning of the next phrase in the Mishnah that they are not similar to the defining characteristic of the category of fire, in which there is no living spirit? Clearly, maveh is not fire. So, contrary to the Mishnah, where 4 primary categories of damage were enumerated, Rabbi Oshaya in the Tosefta taught there are 13 primary categories of damage. And the 13 categories consist of 4 bailees, 5 types of indemnity, and the 4 primary categories listed in our Mishnah. The 4 bailees are, this is something we'll come to know well, the unpaid bailee, the borrower, the paid bailee, and the renter, right? There's 4 different relationships that I could have with another person where my property is under his care and then something happens to that property, right? It could be that I just asked him to watch it for me without paying him. He's doing me a favor. It could be that I asked him to watch it for me and I'm paying him to watch it. It could be that he borrowed the property from me so that he could use it. And it could be that he's renting the property from me so that he could use it and I'm getting paid. Now, in those 4 different situations, there's going to be different kinds of liability if the property is damaged while it's under his care. And it makes sense, right? If I'm paying him to watch it to make sure nothing happens to it and something happens to it, he's going to have a different level of responsibility than if I just asked him as a favor to me to watch it for me. If he's renting it from me, that's going to have a different outcome than if I'm paying him to watch it for me. If he's borrowing it from me, that's going to have a different outcome than if he's paying me to use it, right? You can see that. So those are the 4 bailee relationships. They're going to have different kinds of damages associated with them. And then the 5 types of indemnity that one is liable to pay for injuring another person are damage, the actual damage that you did or your animal did, pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation for suffering that damage. And with the 4 primary categories enumerated in the Mishnah, that is a total of 13, right? So you can see, like, what are we talking about? It's kind of interesting to the bailee relationships, the 5 types of indemnity, and the 4 primary kinds of damage, that we're not really talking about what is causing the damage. What we're talking about is how much damages are owed when there is some kind of harm that falls out. And in all these different cases, there's going to be different outcomes. Now, the Gemara asks, and what is the reason the tanna of our Mishnah does not teach these 9 categories in our Mishnah here, Mishnah number 1 of chapter 1? Why is it the tanna of our Mishnah does not teach these other 9 categories of damages and enumerates only 4? Granted, according to the opinion of Shmuel, who says that maveh is eating, it is with regard to the categories of damage caused by one's property that the tanna of our Mishnah speaks. With regard to categories of damage caused by one's body, the tanna of our Mishnah does not seem to be speaking if maveh refers to something that an ox does. But according to the opinion of Rav, who says that maveh is man, so let the tanna of our Mishnah teach these 9 categories as well. And the Gemara answers, according to Rav, the Mishnah teaches the primary category of man, and included in that category are all matters of damage that are caused by man, and among them would be the 9 categories listed by Rabbi Oshaya. So the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Oshaya too, doesn't the Mishnah teach the primary category of man? Why then did he enumerate the 4 bailees and the 5 types of indemnity? And the Gemara answers, in his enumeration, Rabbi Oshaya distinguishes between 2 types of damage caused by a man. He teaches cases involving a man who injures another person, and he teaches the primary category of maveh, which involves the cases of a man who damages an ox or damages other property belonging to another person. So the Gemara asks, if so, with regard to ox as well, let him teach 2 categories of ox. Let him teach the case of an ox that damages an ox or other property belonging to another person, and let him teach the case of an ox that injures a person. And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. What is this comparison? Granted, in the case of a man who damages another's ox or their property, he pays merely for the damage. In the case of a man who injures another person, he pays an additional 4 types of indemnity payments: pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation. But with regard to damage caused by an ox, what difference is there to me if it is an ox that damages an ox or other property belonging to another person? And what difference is there to me if it is an ox that injures a person? In both this case and that case, the owner of the ox pays merely for the damage. Therefore, unlike a case where a person causes the damage, there is no reason to distinguish between cases where an ox causes damage based on the victim of that damage. with regard to the assertion that Rabbi Oshaya added only cases involving a man who injures another person, the Gemara asks, but aren't there the categories of the unpaid bailee and the borrower, the paid bailee and the renter, which are categories that describe a man who damages another's ox or other property, as the cases referred to by Rabbi Oshaya are those where the bailee fails to return the deposit that he was entrusted to safeguard. What was he watching? What did he borrow from me? What did I pay him to watch for me? Was it my ox? Could be. Was it my money? Could be. Was it my apartment? Could be. Right? All these kinds of things are possible. And yet, Rabbi Oshaya teaches each type of bailee as distinct categories and does not include them under the rubric of man, one of the four categories enumerated in the Mishnah. So the Gemara answers that the reason why Rabbi Oshaya enumerates man separately from the bailees is that he teaches one category of man, referring to damage that is engendered by direct action, for example, the 5 types of indemnity payments, and he teaches the 4 bailees, referring to damage that occurs on its own. For example, failure of the 4 bailees to safeguard the deposit. And the Gemara cites a third listing of primary categories of damage. That was Rabbi Oshaya. He had 13 categories. Rabbi Chiya teaches that there are 24 primary categories of damage. He adds payment of double the principal that is paid by a thief who is apprehended and convicted based on the testimony of witnesses and who does not admit his crime, and payment of 4 or 5 times the principal paid by a thief who steals an ox or a sheep respectively and then slaughters or sells it, and the payment of the principal by a thief who admits his crime, and a robber who steals openly and by force or threat of violence, and conspiring witnesses who pay the individual against whom they falsely testified with regard to a sum that they conspired to cause him to lose. And then there is the rapist and the seducer who seduces an unmarried young woman, and they pay a fine of 50 selah. And there's the defamer, i.e. one who defames his wife by claiming falsely in court that he discovered that she was not a virgin when he consummated the marriage, and he alleges that she engaged in intercourse with another man while betrothed, and it's discovered that he's a liar, and he pays a fine of 100 selah. And there's also one who causes another's teruma to become ritually impure, rendering it prohibited to partake of that teruma. And there is the case of one who mixes teruma with another's non-sacred food, rendering it prohibited for any priest to partake of it. And one who pours another's wine as a libation for idolatry. When one combines the 11 categories enumerated by Rabbi Chiya and these 13 that were enumerated by Rabbi Oshaya, then you get a total of 24 principal categories of damage. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And, I think it's worth just taking a step back for a second and saying, what are we talking about here? The Torah, it does many things, right? It's the origin tale of the universe. It's the origin tale of the Jewish people. It also functions as a law book. And there are many, many specific laws about when somebody causes harm to another, what kind of a penalty would ensue, what kind of damages are going to be owed. And the Torah, is very terse and just mentions some of these instances where a person damages another person, or his property damages another person, or his property damages the property of another person, and that certain penalties will ensue. But the Torah is not laid out like the U.S. Civil Code with many tables of contents and subcontents and sub-subcontents, to lay out what are the elements of a tort and what are the damages that accrue, etc. Right? The Torah is much more sort of narrative based. It includes a lot of laws, but we're also, hearing about them in the context of Moses is teaching these laws to the children of Israel while they're wandering in the wilderness on their way from Egypt to the promised land. But since it is a law book, and we have to apply these laws to a functioning society where lawsuits are brought in courts, etc., now we see why the rabbis are so painstakingly taking those codified laws in the Torah and sort of breaking them down, into sort of logical categories so that they can extend the principles to other kinds of situations which arise. The Gemara asks, and as for Rabbi Oshaya, what is the reason that he did not teach these 11 additional categories? And the Gemara answers, it is with regard to cases where one is liable to pay monetary restitution that Rabbi Oshaya speaks. With regard to cases where one is liable to pay a fine, Rabbi Oshaya does not speak. And the Gemara asks, what of the cases of a thief and a robber, which are cases where one is liable to pay monetary restitution, let Rabbi Oshaya also teach those cases and include them in his list? And the Gemara answers, doesn't he teach those cases as he enumerated in his list, the unpaid bailee and the borrower? An unpaid bailee who takes a false oath that the deposit was stolen when in fact it remained in his possession, he is liable to pay restitution like a thief. And finally, the Gemara asks, and as for Rabbi Chia too, doesn't he teach those cases as he enumerates in his list the unpaid bailee and the borrower? Why does Rabbi Chia list them separately? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Chia makes a distinction between different types of theft. He teaches cases of theft with regard to property that came into one's possession in a permitted manner. For example, an unpaid bailee was entrusted with a deposit and later misappropriated it. And he teaches cases of theft with regard to property that came into one's possession in a prohibited manner. For example, the actions of a thief and a robber. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. Let me check if we've got some comments or questions on Bava Kamma, page 4. Okay, so earlier we talked about saying Kaddish, and we don't say an actual Kaddish in the absence of a minyan, but to honor Yossi Hershkovitz, who gave his life in defense of Israel, as I mentioned at the top of the show, that a member of our minyan, our community, Morris, shared with us tonight in tears that his sister's son had died in Gaza in an operation to neutralize the actual kidnappers who took hostages on October 7th. And he was a 44-year-old man with 5 children who lost his life. And so we dedicate our learning to him tonight. And for the sake of peace in Israel. And now somebody asked me to say Kaddish, so I'm just going to say it in English. So here's an English translation of the Aramaic prayer, Kaddish, that we say for the dead at funerals. And like I said it, many times a day for my mom during the year following. When you lose a parent, you say Kaddish. So the translation is like this: magnified and sanctified may his great name be in the world he created by his will. May he establish his kingdom in your lifetime and in your days and in the lifetime of all the house of Israel swiftly and soon, and say Amen. May his great name be blessed forever and all time. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, raised and honored, uplifted and lauded be the name of the Holy One. Blessed be he. Beyond any blessing, song, praise, and consolation uttered in the world, and say Amen. May there be great peace from heaven and life for us and all Israel, and say Amen. May he who makes peace in the high places make peace for us and all Israel, and say Amen. What's fascinating about Kaddish is that's the mourner's prayer, and we say it, on behalf. And by the way, this is not the Kaddish that I normally say. This is an Ashkenaz Kaddish. The Kaddish Sfard that we say in our shul is just a little bit different because it mentions Mashiach, the coming of Mashiach. But at any rate, what's fascinating about Kaddish is that a mourner says that we say that when we're in the midst of grief for the loss of a loved one, but it never mentions death at all. Right? We're saying that magnified and sanctified be God's great name. And that's a difficult thing, right, to ask the mourner who's in the midst of his grief to say God is great, right, even at that moment. Why do we do that? And I think my friend Saul Gorowitz shared tonight a beautiful, beautiful teaching. Now it's last week's Torah portion, Chayei Sarah, that we read this morning in synagogue, which opens, right, with the death of Sarah. The parsha is called The Life of Sarah, but it opens with the death of Sarah. And then Abraham, in order to bury her, he purchases the cave of Machpelah, which becomes the burial place of the patriarchs in Hebron. And what's interesting about it is when it says that Abraham mourned there's a small chaf. It's one of those places in the Torah where one letter is either diminished or enlarged. And so the letter chaf is diminished in the term for mourning there. And what do we learn from that? I mean, there's many opinions offered what that teaches. And one idea that Saul shared tonight, I think in the name of, might have been the Ger Rebbe, but I'm not sure, was that, it's brought down in the Midrash that why did Sarah die at that time? She died when she heard about the Akedas Yitzhak, right? That Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his son, and it was a test. Abraham was ready to do it. Yitzhak was ready to give his life, and then God said, "Okay, I know you guys you mean it. You have faith and trust in God. You'll do what I command, and because of that, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed, and the Jewish people will be a great people." But when she heard about it, her soul left this world. Now, at that point, that's a midrash, right? The Torah doesn't say that. What it says is that after that incident, she died. But one might think that, Abraham might have heard that she died as soon as she heard about it, and he would think, God, what are you doing to me? First you asked me to kill my son, who you already told me is going to be the one who brings the legacy, of this monotheistic belief, and transmit everything that I am to these future generations that are going to be the Jewish people. And now you asked me to kill him. Okay, you didn't mean that, so I didn't have to do it. We were ready to do it. He and I passed the test, but now that test kills my wife? What are you doing? You might have thought that Abraham would say something like that and become angry. He didn't. He didn't connect those things. Because when people die in this world, we don't understand why, but it was their time, right? It was their time. And lest you think that somebody who tragically dies when they're young, that they were sort of robbed of that opportunity to perform all these mitzvahs that they could have performed in their life, that they would have gotten credit for, when they show up in heaven, and it's apportioned to them what your place in the next world is. Well, if they were cut off young, they didn't get to do all those mitzvahs that might have earned for them a higher place in heaven, says the Ger Rebbe, or at least whoever Saul was quoting. No, when you're cut off young, and all the more so when you're cut off young making a Kiddush Hashem, like fighting in this war, you get credit for all the mitzvahs that you would have done later in your life. And Abraham, in other words, Abraham, his faith was not shaken, when his wife died. In fact, she had a good long life, and her deeds are recounted in the Bible and is beloved, by all humanity, Sarah. But that's the reason why he mourned, but his mourning was not so intense because she did live a full, long life. It wasn't as long as his life, and anytime you lose your wife, even at any age, it's going to be so painful. But he knows that she lived out her years. She fully lived her years, and that was part of that teaching. Elvis, would the laws of oxen as described here be applicable to today to a person's dog, for example? I think very much so. Right? If your dog your dog is not a biter, okay, and then you're used to walking without a leash, and then suddenly bites someone, but he never bit anyone before, I think, that probably would be like the innocuous ox. But if your dog has bitten a bunch of people, and now you're not walking him on a leash, and he goes and bites someone, that sounds like the habitual gorer to me. So I think so. I can't guarantee it, but sounds right to me. And finally, Bill, well, that's all well and good for arguing that maveh can't be water, but surely there must be a category of water damages. Last Christmas Eve, my apartment flooded because the landlord forgot to turn on the heat in the vacant apartment above me, and the pipes burst without water. Category damages, how could I recoup my losses? I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure, we'll get to it later, that water in this sense is fire, right? In other words, it's not an ox, right? Water might be pit, but I think it's going to be fire. And the difference between pit and fire, both of which don't involve a living agent, is that the pit is stationary and the fire moves. So water that went from one apartment to another, that would come under the fire category. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific.